So welcome back, everyone. We're going to have our first guest, Rudyard Lynch, of What If Alt History, join us for a discussion of what we're calling the rise and fall and rise of America. I want to talk a little bit about Rudyard before he comes on. I'm a huge fan of his. If you haven't checked out What If Alt Hist on YouTube, I really encourage you to go out to his YouTube channel. This is a young man at the age of 13, started his own podcast. I think it was on his 13th birthday. He's now 21 years old. And he is a voracious reader and digester of information, concepts, et cetera. He's probably the best read human being I've ever met in my life. And he has spent the past 8+ years gathering and distilling information around societies, on civilizations. And he's going to talk a little bit about America and where we stand in sort of the evolutionary path of from barbarism to civilization to decadence. He talks about all these sorts of things that are really brilliant. And he's going to talk a little bit, most importantly, about, so what are the things that America, well, let me back up. I found the America's Future series in large part because I wanted to ensure that America remained the strongest military, political, and economic power in the world, that all civilizations die. They go through a birth and decay and death cycle. And I just would like to see that be forestalled as long as possible. We'd like to see America remain sort of the great hegemon, if you want to call it that, a force for good in the world, along with its partners, along with its allies, for as long as possible. And I'm very much gratified, and it's very positive to talk to somebody like Rudyard who could talk a little bit about America. He's actually much more positive about it than I am. He thinks that America is going to stay strong and has a lot of competitive advantages for decades to come, if not even hundreds of years. So with that, we're going to break for just a second, and when we come back, we're going to bring Rudyard Lynch of What If Alt History. Hey there, we're back, and I'm here with my great and good friend Rudyard Lynch, somebody you all need to know, and I think policy leaders need to know. I think they could learn a lot from him. So, great to have you here, Rudyard. Thank you for coming all the way to Austin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad you're here. So, if you would tell us just a little tiny bit about yourself, I gave a little preamble, et cetera,
Sure thing.
And then most importantly, what you're going to talk about today.
David flatters me beyond comparison here, and what I hope to stick up to those standards in my presentation today. And I am the creator behind What If Alt Hist. What If Alt Hist is, to brag for half a second, one of the largest history and politics channels in the world. We have 500,000 subscribers. We have 2 million viewers a month. And David was right when he said I made it on my 13th birthday, largely out of boredom. And I did something called alternate history for the longest time, which is like, what if the South won the Civil War? What if the Nazis won World War II? And through that, trying to figure out what could have happened from that. And I did that for 6 years, but then through trying to figure out what could happen if history had gone differently, I started to figure out principles of human history and politics. And now what the channel's more so about is trying to figure out why civilizations rise and fall. And from that, trying to understand the future and what principles under which human societies operate. And I'm basically entirely self-taught. I dropped out of school after a semester and became a digital nomad. And this is my full-time job. I have a staff behind me. And it's insane, right? It's hard to believe this is what I do, but I feel really blessed to be able to have this opportunity.
Yeah, we live in a new world. Guys like you didn't exist 10 years ago.
No. Yeah, it's crazy.
Great to have you. So we're going to cycle through these things. We've got Ken here with us. Who's going to help us go through these things. And if you would just point at Ken, and he'll advance the slides.
Wonderful. So the first point I'm going to hit is lots of people wonder when I bring this up, especially people who aren't part of the same industry as me, is can you actually use history in order to understand principles of the world? And what I would say is, if you use this logic in any of the sciences, that would just be silly. If you look at geology or looking at climate and you didn't look at the previous precedent in order to establish what the future could be, you'd be laughed out of the room. But when you deal with history and philosophy and all that, people's identities and politics and sacralizations come out. And so things get much more difficult. But I think it's still important because if you have no sense of the past, you have no sense of the future.
Right. And we have to learn from it. Otherwise, we'll repeat it, right?
One of the points that I like to say in my show is that the problem most people have when they try to predict the future is that they're like fish in a pond where the fish inside that pond have never seen anything outside of it. We don't know the context that we're part of because those fish, they're part of the pond. Most of their bodies from the water that came from it. And because of that, we are incapable of understanding what makes our period of history weird or special or strange or any of that. And so most people, when they try to predict the future, just look at the next 30 years and what happened in the last 30 years. But the reality is that it's a constantly shifting series of curves, and different things can start and stop at different times. And we don't really know about that. And it's incredibly difficult. And I like to say on the YouTube channel that my job is betting against God, because there's a million ways to be wrong and only a handful to be right. And I like to use this map to start because this is a map of the major alliances in the world. And we don't like to view the world in these terms really because it conflicts with various notions we have. But in the same way as any other hero of history, these are Chinese or Russian or American allies, and they're all kind of trying to build out their own spheres of influence.
So the blue section is sort of the Western Alliance,
Yes.
right? And the yellow, the red, et cetera, the various allied powers.
Yeah.
And these are sort of the sides, if you will, right?
Yeah.
In the current state.
So through my study of trying to figure out how history works, I found that there are 3 separate cycles of history. We're going to talk here more so at the second and the third ones. There's a shorter one, which is generational. And we use it, for example, where Strauss and Howe, they found that the English-speaking world had political crises roughly every 80 years. And the current one we're having, then World War II, then the US Civil War. And this is a smaller focus, and David brought me on here to talk about why civilizations rise and fall. And so we're going to look at the second and the third one, where you can look at historic cycles over a 250-year period. We're roughly on that time scale. Civilizations have political crises, and there's a longer one you can look at for how civilizations across their history operate. And there's really stark similarities you can find over the long durée of history and how the life cycles of different civilizations operate. So the first point I would make is that it's really remarkable that you can predict when countries will have political and social crises based off a series of metrics. And you can actually use computer models to do this. And this is something called a secular crisis, where David Hackett Fisher and Peter Turchin have found these various variables that allow you to predict when a country is going to have a civil war or a social crisis. And the last time this happened in the Western world was around the French Revolution. Then before that, the wars of religion in the 1600s. Before that, the Black Death. And you can find this stretching back 3,000 years. And it's a very long-standing thing. And interestingly enough, this sort of crisis predicts so many of the problems we're having in our society today, where it's like, for example, we have extremely high inequality, low wages for normal people, high amounts of political polarization and fanaticism. People are getting married and having children at a later rate with less children, not a lot of social trust and high social tension. Social institutions are weaker, and people are scared that we'll have a civil war or a major war. And these are all things that are predictive of the sort of crises that these authors talk about. And the brilliant thing is Peter Turchin, who I think is one of the best history writers of our time, he found 2 separate metrics you can use to predict when crises like this happen. The first is the amount of money held by the top 0.1% of the population. Then after that, there's the average wages of a normal person. And if you put these 2 metrics together, you're actually able, and Turchin has done this, to predict when countries will have revolutions or civil wars in the years they did. And he's done this with the fall of the Roman Republic, the fall of the Roman Empire, the the Russian Civil War, the wars of religion in the 1600s, and he had a computer model in 2010 predict that America would have a major political crisis in the 2020s. And that's not something that people really took for granted at the time, where in 2010, if you had told people everything that had happened since, I think a significant amount of people just would not believe you.
I
And
wouldn't have.
yeah. And you have what to say?
I said I wouldn't. I would
Yeah, yeah.
not believe that we live in the times that we live in, the change that we've seen, et cetera, and some of the crises that we've dealt with.
Yeah. And through those two metrics, you can predict when societies are going to have problems. And Turchin worries that we will have social issues equal to the Russian Civil War or the fall of the Roman Republic over the next couple of decades. And let me explain why this happens. The first driving factor is wages are suppressed, where it can happen for a series of reasons, whether immigration, population growth, automation, globalization, and those are all complicated things with positives and negatives. But economics says when you grow a labor pool and don't have any other factors, it'll suppress wages. And we've seen this in America over the last 50 years. We're looking at Homer Simpson as an example. In the 80s, he was a lower middle class loser, but he supported 3 kids, had a wife, and they lived comfortably, and that was just normal for the era he lived in. But now a lot of people in my age group, they'll have both parents working and they can't afford to have any kids or to get a house. And what ends up happening when wages are suppressed is that capital or people's ability to use money goes up. And this means that you have growing and growing rates of inequality that feed back into each other as the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. And as people can't afford to have children or time to maintain relationships, you see population birth rates collapse. You see collapse in social conditions and society. And interesting factor is there's 20 metrics you can use to predict when these kind of crises happen. And they range from stuff like average height, amount of strength of social communities. But one of them is when the average age of marriage gets above 28, you're going to have a social crisis because humans are fundamentally animals. And so when humans are worried that their biological destiny is not going to make it, they start to freak out, and then you start to have major political problems. And as moderates can't fix the crises going on, people go for more and more radical people, and society is split into having wars or civil wars. Exactly, because you either have the society split into different elites, and each elite pushes their own special interests, or people try to use political unrest as a way to basically unify their society. And
so I think something you just said is really important. When the status quo can't solve a problem, then people look to extremists to solve that problem.
yes,
And we see a lot of that. There's this bifurcation in America, there's this polarization, et cetera. And that's appealing to people because if they have a problem, they will say, well, this hasn't worked before. So these people say they have an answer and they're willing to go to extremes.
exactly. If your local centrist candidate isn't providing you what you need, you have no reason not to go for a more radical one. And people split into separate groups based off what they're self-interested in. That could be the parliamentarians in the English Civil War. It could be the optimates in the fall of the Roman Republic. And now it's the Republicans and Democrats. And I make the argument that that's fundamentally a college, non-college educated divide. But I'm not here to fully talk about this crisis because David brought me here to talk about the rise and fall of civilizations. But what all these stats mean is that the world will likely have a major crisis over the next 20 to 30 years. And this could mean a civil war, a global war, a famine, disease, political crises, a recession, or a financial crisis. And the thing is, I only have 50 minutes to talk here, but my YouTube channel is hundreds of hours of content. So for everything you're looking at, I have a 40-minute video in of itself about. And like, there's just a couple things I find very worrying over the next couple of decades. My researcher did a project on global food and fertilizer, and he found that Africa and the Middle East are slated for massive food dependency issues. Large parts of the world, like Asia, Europe, China, Japan, their populations are going to have over the next 60 years because they just don't have a high enough birth rate. And that's why I think they're going to have major political problems. And America is very lucky, and we'll talk about America's strengths in the future, but we have the most stable demographics of any industrialized society. And I also worry about everything you've seen here, like a financial crisis since we're the era of the most money printing ever in world history. But I'm going to get back on a topic to the thing David brought me here to talk about, which is the cycles of civilizations and what America can do as a future power. So we talked about the short cycle around 250 years. And what that predicts is that our society will have a crisis, but then we'll be able to form a new elite. And then in 30 years or something, we'll have a golden age. And that's something you see roughly every 250 years. And then there's a longer cycle, which is something Spengler, who's a historian around 100 years ago, went into. And it's that civilizations have similar life cycles across history and across time. And the thing here is that we don't understand that civilizations are living, breathing organisms. They're groups of people. And so it makes sense that they have life cycles like other living organisms.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a similarity. And I have a long video about this, comparing the Greeks and the Romans to the modern West. But you can line up different societies' levels of development according to how long they've been around. And for example, you can see that 700 years after the founding of their civilization, both Western and Greco-Roman civilization reached their highest philosophic point. And a couple hundred years after that, they were unified by a large empire, whether the Romans or the Americans. And this is a chart that I think is great. And I know this is something
that's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, David's really into. And this is a theory of history where a lot of what I talk about in my YouTube channel is just things every era of history believed until 40 years ago. And this is a theory of history that Herodotus, Ibn Khaldun, who is the best Muslim historian, Livy, Machiavelli, Plutarch, we even have Genghis Khan and Cyrus the Great talk about it. It was just, as well as my favorite historians of the last century, where it was just an accepted part of the world. And it's that societies start in a state of barbarism. And that is when they have a lot of energy and a lot of vigor, where the West has had two of these cycles, but the most recent ones in the early modern period, where in 15 and 1600s, we burned witches. We had the conquistadors. The West was really brutal in conquering areas, but also it had a massive birth rate and a lot of energy. And that's what barbarism is. It's a state of people are very close to the earth because life is hard. And so they can't afford to really be silly. And then you move over to civilization, which in the West was the 17 and 1800s, where you still had that degree of savagery, but it was tempered more so by rationality. It was tempered by the ability to think critically, where barbarian societies are kind of bigoted and they dislike other groups just for being different.
They're tribal.
Exactly. And then once you move to civilization, there's more of a degree of rationality. And they still have that energy. And so in the West, it was the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, that whole era. And after that, you move on to decadence. And one of the reasons people don't like using history in order to figure out what's going to happen in the present and the future is that it often tells us things we don't want to hear. And,
Well, so the term decadence is
Yes.
sort of a pejorative, and it triggers some people, et cetera. And so if you would talk a little about what decadence
Yes.
means in terms of sort of being self-absorbed, being insulated, being silly.
yes. Next slide, next
Next
slide,
slide,
please,
please.
sir.
There we go.
So thank you for that point, David, because I kind of get stuck in my own community sometimes. And decadent does not mean the chocolate cake from your local bakery. What decadence means is social insulation from the outside world, where a decadent society puts its own socially constructed vision of reality ahead of what the real world actually is. And what happens in a decadent society, and I'll talk about this later in the video, is certain factions of the elite are able to run society, and they build people's conceptions of reality based around what their ideological vision of the world is. And you see large amounts of inequality. People are split off from actually making decisions in their life. And this happened to Europe in the 20th and the 21st centuries. You start seeing that with totalitarianism like communism and Nazism, which happened as people were alienated from the traditional axes that their society had used. And I hope I don't make enemies here. You also see it in Europe's declining position in the world, where Europe used to be 38% of the world's economy, and now it's a quarter. Europe used to be by far the world's greatest technological, economic, military, political center. And since World War II, the Americans have surpassed them in all of those metrics. And there are some great examples of other kinds of decadence in history, where in 1000 AD, for both China and India were founded at the same time. So their civilizational cycles happen at the same time, even though they're very different civilizations in a lot of ways. And 1000 AD, the Liao Manchu people were attacking North China, and they were nomadic horse tribes, and they were outnumbered 100 to 1, or their population, there were 100 Chinese for each Manchu, but the Manchus still won and they conquered northern China. And what ended up happening was that the Chinese wrote poetry about how much they wanted to reconquer the north, but they were actually refused to improve their militaries because there was a Chinese saying that went, in the same way good iron doesn't go into, the same way you use bad iron for nails, you don't use good men for the army. And so the army was kind of this pariah social class that they refused to
invest in.
Yeah, and India was the same thing, where the Ghaznavid Turks were coming down with Afghans into northern India. Again, the Indians outnumbered these Turks 100 to 1 in population, but the Turks still won, and they could beat Indian armies outnumbered like 5 to 1. And the Indians refused to improve their militaries. They instead built temples to favor the gods. And this is a pattern you see. Decadence happens in every civilization. It happens in India, China, the Roman Empire. And
so it's a lack of practicality,
Yeah.
a lack of vigor, a lack of focus. It's the ability, if you will, it's the largesse to focus on things that are maybe not critical, et cetera, because you're insulated,
yes,
because you're wealthy. You could call it affluenza or
Yeah.
terms like that. But and the worry that I have, and one of the reasons I wanted you to talk is, you know, if you look at America's trajectory, we came out with a lot of vigor, a very innovative culture and society, and not all good or bad. We get that, et cetera. And America has sort of reached a peak of zenith. It's the top military, political, and economic power in the world, and the worry is that won't continue. And because we don't really view ourselves as having any real existential threats, even though we do, we don't view ourselves that way. We have the license, we have the luxury, if you will, to end up fighting amongst ourselves. And that's what I worry about the most. I worry more about partisanship and tribalism and us doing the work of our enemies. I would argue the Chinese look at us every day and go, thank you, you're doing a great job. Destroy yourselves and we don't have to. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's very well said, David. And it reminds me of when the Romans invaded ancient Greece. The Romans let the Greeks often let the Romans into their cities peacefully because they would rather have the Romans rule than their other local faction in Greece.
The enemy of my cousin is my friend.
Exactly. And that's a very common thing in decadence, where we're so divided that we can't actually look at external threats because we're so driven off. Because when you make your worldview the reality, that means the other people who stand against you in your worldview are more dangerous than the Mongol horde outside. Next, please. And this is just a brief point I'll run through, and I think this is kind of fun. And it's that the video I just finished is understanding American culture. And there are 3 countries that I think are good parallels to America. In cultural science, there's a bunch of different cultural metrics you can use. And America's closest to Britain in almost all of them. So culturally, America's very close to Britain. As you'll see later in this, I can't say video because this isn't a video, but in this talk is Rome. And so America's history and its trajectory as a society parallels Rome very closely. And America is very similar to China in its geography, where both America and China are the most powerful person in their neighborhood, and no one can really threaten them in their neighborhood. And America and China are actually at the same latitudes, where the south of China is at Miami, Beijing's at Philadelphia, the north of China is in Manchuria. So I like using this as a way to understand America through the historic record. And through all these cycles of history, America is closest to the world in 100 BC, where we're going to talk about why America and Rome are so similar, but that was when Rome was in a similar position to where America is now. And it was also the fall of the late Roman Republic. Next, please. Yeah. And America and Rome are quite similar because they were both founded as very strict Puritan nations that expanded rapidly. They were republics built off trying to protect their people's freedoms. And they had, the Romans had their own version of the Constitution. And they very rapidly rose to become the known world's biggest power through fighting a series of wars that they didn't like, in the same way we got into World War I and World War II out of bizarre alliance structures. It was the same with the Romans getting into the Macedonian and the Punic Wars. And that made Rome the great power.
Because
And
the others were weakened, just
yeah,
as Europe was weakened after World War II and World War I,
exactly.
that left us as the strongest power.
Yes. And there's a lot of very stark similarities between the world in 100 BC and the world of America today, where, for example, both have massive inequality, where in Rome you had the rise of giant latifundia or corporations, which would outcompete the working wages of average Romans. And they'd bring in slaves from Gaul or Syria, and a small Roman farmer couldn't compete. So that caused massive inequality. And it's the equivalent of globalization today, where American workers, I'm from Pennsylvania, so deindustrialization is my whole childhood, can't compete with workers in Malaysia or China, which causes inequality. Both of them rose to the sole world superpower without any real competition around 100 BC. Both were massively politically polarized, and Rome was in the optimates and populates parties. There was decline in religion and traditional values. In ancient Rome, there was a sexual liberation and feminist movement, actually, in the similar timescale to ours. Both of them had weakening democratic foundations, where in Rome you saw the rise of individual strongmen as normal politicians couldn't really bring home the bacon. And you can go through so many parallels. They had insane campaign funding. There were human rights concerns with Roman armies abroad. And at the same time, the relationship between Greece and, I have an hour-long video talking about this, so I can't go into too much depth, but Greece is very similar to Europe's history, and Rome is very similar to America's. And the Romans went into Greece in the same way the Europeans went into America, where they were sympathetic to the democratic Greek countries and they viewed them as cultural relatives. And so they went in to protect them from other countries, like big empires like the Macedonians with Seleucids, in the same way it was us for the Nazis and the Soviets. But then over time, the Romans established the Achaean League, which is like the European Union, and the Europeans lost less and less importance until the point that they had trouble being independent from America.
So when I listen to what you talk about,
Yeah.
and I look at the trajectory, I tend to be pragmatic, and I think, so what's next for America? So when you look at where we're at and all these parallels fall, I've always been a little bit dismal, and I've always been a little bit negative or pessimistic, saying it at some point it's going to fall. But you also talk, and maybe you'll cover that in a second here, but
Yeah.
the fundamental structural things that make America's longevity, its ability to compete and its ability to stay sort of relevant and in power, are actually solid.
Yeah, I have a future slide about this, and so I'll just cover that now. The thing with Rome is that starting in the point we're at, Rome survived for another 500 years, and the Romans had a local crisis, but they were still fundamentally strong. And America is in the exact same place, where we look at China or Russia or any of those other competing countries, none of them have the strength America does, where China and Russia, for example, is a population 1/3 of America's, let alone America's allies. It is an economy smaller than Canada. India is so ethnically diverse and big and complicated that it has trouble expanding outwards, let alone keeping itself intact. And China's the big competitor we always worry about, where like for my whole life, people have been saying China's going to replace America, but I don't believe that because a bunch of different reasons. The first of which being China's population is going to halve over the next 70 years.
Because of the one-child rule,
Yeah.
and because of their societal, the outlook that people have. They don't want to have children. They don't think they can afford them.
Yeah, and there's a term called l'ancien regime, which was all the weird corruption that happened before the French Revolution. And China's like that, where there's all these weird corrupt policies. And an example I love is their real estate market, where the Communist Party wanted all the taxes. So the only way local governments could pull taxes through their real estate markets. What ended up happening is corrupt dealings between real estate moguls and the local governments that jacked up the prices. So the Chinese real estate market is a quarter of their whole economy. And normal people will work for 20 years, working 12 hours a day to afford a four-sided concrete shack, because there's all these incentives to make the real estate market insanely overvalued. And what ends up happening is people can never afford to have kids because they're stuck in apartments that are the size of horse stalls. And it's China's like that writ large, and there are all these weird.
And that's funnily because they have a sort of a despotic leader.
Yeah.
Sorry, China. They have a strong man who doesn't want to listen to anything other than
Yes.
good news, and everyone is desperately afraid of him.
Yeah, and it's horrifying to look at now because it looks like they're trying to install a new form of Maoism, which is, if you study Xi Jinping thought, he literally says we should return to our Maoist roots, and he talks about no more foreign education. They literally tell people your duty is to serve the Chinese nation, and we expect you to die in war. And there's mass famine in China because they shut off. Imagine if in America we shut off trade for food between states. That's what China did, and people have been starving there. And like, because their country has so many problems, whether environmental, social, political, Xi Jinping is kind of playing a terrified game, and he's acting in a really despotic way. And it's sad. And I think the chances China has a revolution in the next 5 years are really high.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is really important is we're having a discussion right here about some very interesting and complicated topics, and they're all nuanced. Okay.
Yeah.
This is something that doesn't happen a lot. And I think America needs to have more of. If people can sit down, and there might be a lot of people that might even disagree with some of the things that Rudyard has been saying or that I say, et cetera, that's fine. But if we can be respectful and we can have an open and honest dialogue, if we can listen to the other person and not project what we think they're saying, et cetera, which we see all the time, that's the element that I worry most about us in America, that we are becoming tribal, becoming fractionalized, whatever, and we're attacking ourselves and doing the work of our enemy, and it's in part because we've lost the art or the ability to speak to each other with respect and to listen.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And the thing that I worry about with America is exactly that, where I think no one really in America wants China to win. But the thing is, we're so internally divided that
we don't focus on it nearly enough.
Exactly. And the thing with the Romans is, what happened to them is they stayed the preeminent power. And in America, we have loads of advantages, like the average youngest population. We have
energy, food.
Exactly. We're preeminent in most things like technology, like Hollywood, Wall Street, and we built up those institutions over centuries. And it's difficult for societies to really compete with that. But what did happen with Rome was that their society fell apart. And the Romans used to be they used to have a lot of values. They cared about freedom, they cared about honor, they cared about they cared about the value of life. But then what ended up happening is they became wealthy. They shoved all their values down the toilet. And you ended up with tyrants like Caligula or Nero, who did things so unspeakable, I can't talk about them here.
So there's this notion, if you this cycle that soft times create soft people create, or how it goes. Soft people create soft times, et cetera, which end up creating hard times, and then hard people create soft times. There's this whole long thing about that, right? And there are these cycles of affluence where one becomes a little bit, for better word, soft. Clearly, the generation before me worked harder, worked longer, was more focused, less hedonistic, if you will, than mine, and so on and so on. That can't continue forever. If that continues going to where we all ultimately become like in Wall-E, where we're laying around in a floating lounge chair drinking a Slurpee, and we can't physically get up when the ship crashes, breaks down, that can't happen. And I see a change. I'm very heartened because I see a reinvigoration, sort of a coming together, people saying, hey, the poles, the tails can't wag the dog. We've got to figure out a way, true unity. We have to figure out a way to come together, because we are all Americans. And we'd like this society, this grand experiment to continue, and we'd like it to evolve and get better.
I'm not going to say my generation are saviors. We have a lot of very bad problems, but we definitely did grow up in a difficult time, whether economically or socially or politically. And I hope the people who grew up in the current hard times we have will be able to establish the next America that's better for all of us.
So this is America's future. You're talking about as America's future, young people. I hope this impacts people and gives them some food for thought. And I hope also that it helps people have an open dialogue about these issues. That we'll be introspective, that if we don't look at ourselves, if we're not honest with ourselves, if we're not self-aware, we can't address some of the issues that we deal with. So I hope that that's what we want to do on this program and some of the other programs, our various podcasts. We're going to have Rudyard back. He's going to be doing some work with us, et cetera. We're looking for other people to join us. We want to be as diverse as possible. If you have a different take, et cetera, we'll be respectful. We'd love for you to participate. We're going to take a little 5-minute break right now, if it's all right. And then we're going to come back and we're going to continue on with our program.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Rudyard. It's fascinating. Sometimes you make my brain hurt, but that's good for me. I hope everyone enjoyed that. We're going to take a little break and we're going to come back. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rudyard. Well, welcome back. Again, I'm David Hamilton, founder and chairman of the America's Future Series, and I'm here with Rudyard Lynch of What If Alt History. We just had a segment on the rise and fall and rise of America, and I wanted to bring Rudyard back to maybe finish up a little thing about his prescriptions, sort of, which I think are the most important, valuable part, and then also talk a little bit about our upcoming podcast. We're working on a podcast together called Common Ground, and this is basically the fundamental notion of how people can have complicated, nuanced, sometimes difficult conversations about important matters with respect, et cetera, all around topics that impact U.S. global competitiveness and national security. So we're going to be doing that. I'll be honest, he brings a young, hip, broad audience that I don't have. I have a little gray hair and I know some important people, and we're able to bring those together. He knows some important people. I know a lot of people are way smarter than me. And so the idea is to bring those people to come on and talk with people that are, again, smarter than me. So I'm really looking forward to that, Rudyard. And what I thought we might do is, the real reason I brought you on was to give this positive, upbeat, and sort of the antidote, if you will, for decadence.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear you finish that out for about the next 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. As well, I'm really excited for us to do our podcast together. I think it's going to be really incredible. And if any of my fans are in the audience watching, I can promise it's going to be something really cool that you're all going to love. And the biggest thing that kills decadence in a society, or brings decadence, is when people get social popularity for doing things that do not help the broader society. They get popularity for doing things that are antithetical to society's success. And from this chart right up in front of you, the biggest cause is a single social class hijacking the whole society, where this happens in every civilization. It happened in China with the bureaucracy, the priests in India, the slave owners in Rome. And in the West, I worry that the managerial class, which is what people call, this happened around World War II, and there was a lot written on it then, but basically people with college degrees in the government or in major corporations moving in and then taking control of the whole society. And this is something that I worry about, that this is the way that the West could become decadent, where we establish an ideological vision of the world, and then, like every other major civilization, we get hijacked by a single social class. And then people follow those class interests rather than what's good for the society. And I'm going to give a series of counters that I believe will help America as a civilization survive in the future. And the first one is decentralization, where America's greatest advantage as a society is our ability to switch out elites, where most cultures just have a single elite, and when that elite fails, the empire dies. But for us, we've had the East Coast merchants, the Deep South aristocrats, the Northern industrialists, the coastal
We're going to work on our slide capabilities here.
I'm just going to talk about the next slide. So
Okay.
The second thing societies need is to have shared values. Where our current society, the right and the left act as different religions, and they share nothing. And because of that, our society can't really do anything. And if a society shares no values, nothing gets accomplished because there's no direction. As my the guy I work with said, the society without a religion or values is like a nation without a capital. And next slide, please. And I mean, these are just some values I think we can all agree to. We all want the truth. We all want honor. We all want freedom. And then move out from there because we need to have them in order to coordinate as a culture.
Real quick, this is also a competition. Okay, so what has happened is internally, because we don't compete with the outside, we have to compete with each other.
Yeah.
And we're advocating for our side over theirs as a way of competing and to have power, right? So the struggle for power internally in a country that doesn't really feel like it has to worry about outside powers.
Yes.
We've sort of bifurcated, and it's us versus them in an effort to gain power.
Yes.
Right? And the religion has become gaining power over the other party and demonizing the other side, regardless of what other side it is, right?
Yes. There's a whole theory of history that empires become big after having to fight against an external opponent for their first couple hundred years. And then from that, they're able to create a shared drive. And for Russia, it's the Mongols. For us, it's the Native Americans. For the English, it's the Vikings. So that sense of having an external opponent is very important for a society's continued success, even though it's not something that's very pretty to believe. And the third and the fourth things are responsibility and ruralization, where what you do not want in a society is small groups of people having power over everything, and they don't have any of the results of their actions. Well, the normal person is completely dispossessed.
They're not connected.
Exactly. And what happens in a lot of empires is that small elite controls everything. People they lose control over their lives, and they become kind of docile and cut off from any sense of action in their lives.
Demotivated.
Yeah, exactly. And so in America, I would recommend we build a society with lots of small business owners where people can actually have drive over their lives while they're working in some giant organization, and they actually have a stake in their society. And the thing is, democracies cannot survive if a majority of people are not stakeholders, because if you don't, it's Latin America, where people vote in radical candidates because they have nothing to lose. And also, rural populations are no urban population in history is able to support its replicate itself, where there's never been a city dwelling population in history that's been able to have a stable birth rate. And once a society's elite becomes predominantly urban, the society quickly loses its ability to wage war, and it moves into it stops being like the society goes in decline. And I don't really know why that is, but I would support an America where people have more control over their economic future in their lives, and also where the population is more rural. And that's something that we're seeing now with digitization.
There's sort of internal migration, et cetera, away from cities to some degree. By the way, if you haven't seen Mouse Utopia, this touches on what you're talking about, urbanization and crowding. You should watch the study, Mouse Utopia. It speaks to what he's talking about.
Also, inequality is terrible for unified society, because if people share basically if there's only a couple very wealthy people and everyone else is dispossessed, it destroys any sense of social unity. Why do you fight for a society where basically you have no stake in anything? And the next thing is, I support ethnic intermixing in America, because people have trouble contextualizing other people in their country if they can't they can't marry them. And if you look at an empire like Austro-Hungary, where there's 12 different ethnicities, it didn't hold together because you viewed your co-nationals as people you had to compete with. But in America, it's good where like your average American is a mix of a bunch of different ethnicities. And if, let's say, I'm of English and Irish ancestry, if my daughter married someone of Japanese ancestry, then I would view them as part of the American whole, because we're all part of basically the same breeding family, as cringe as that sounds.
We don't see each other as different.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's happening in America, where you're seeing larger and larger amounts of racial intermixing. And the final point that I would hit on is, next slide, please, is monogamy and intact families, where one of the strangest videos I've covered, and this talk's kind of funny because I'll make a point and I have an hour-long video about it, and I have to compress into 2 sentences. But you can look at a country's family structure and use it to predict what their political ideology is. So if you know what kind of family a country has, you'll know if it's communist, fascist, democratic, etc. And no stable society has not intact families, where there's a book, the book that explains how you can use families to determine political ideology is The Explanation of Ideology by Todd Emanuel. And then there's another book called Sex and Culture, where 100 years ago, an author went through every single civilization in the world. And he found that once you break down family structure, the society it stops functioning, because interesting point that Todd Emanuel makes is that a society's sense of the divine and the government is dependent upon the role of the father in the society. And so you stop having the ability, because people aren't trained as
How
children.
people view authority.
Yes.
Right. The divine and the government, et cetera. How people view authority, how they view themselves,
Yes.
selflessness, individuality,
Yes.
collectivism is all directly related to
How to
family
raise his
structure,
children.
et cetera, and
Yeah.
and marriage,
And
et cetera.
the final point I'd make is monogamy is very important. Where polygamy is when men have multiple wives, monogamy is when you're married to a single person. And of the top 10 most polygamous societies in the world, each of them is in a civil war now. Because what happens when you're a guy and you have 10 wives is that's 9 men who aren't married. And this is something I'm worried about now, where you're seeing the rise of a more polygamous society, where if you look at dating apps, like a couple guys will get large amounts of women, and then a lot of people aren't getting married and forming families. And it's worrying because you have this giant underclass of men who are basically revolution fodder.
Disaffected.
Yeah, because
disconnected.
They have no incentive. And my final point, I said the last one is my final, this is really my final, is I made a video about the emotions that drive civilizations, where some cultures are guilt-driven, some are shame-driven. We're an anxiety-driven culture, where our culture is based on keeping up with the Joneses and trying to look like we're cool and people like us, and we have no actual shared values or drive. And the thing is, this has happened before in history. The late Roman Republic, France for the Revolution, Tsarist Russia's court. And in each case, it falls to Caesarism. And there's a really wonderful book called The Lonely Crowd. And
See, I don't have to read because I have Rudyard. He reads all this stuff and spills the point. It's great. Yeah.
Thanks. The Lonely Crowd is a book written in 1949, and he very perfectly was able to figure out the direction of American society. And he said it's a lonely crowd because everyone's in the crowd milling around looking for approval, but no one's being authentic. So they're in the crowd, but they're lonely. And what ends up happening, what Amaury Duriancourt said, is that when that happens, a Caesar arises because everyone is insecure. So they're looking for the person with the most confidence to lead them. And so all those societies become dictatorships. And if you look at the pattern that the Romans have, that's something that worries me, where the Romans became a military dictatorship. And you look at my generation is very anxious and is some of the worst mental health in history. And I'll end on this final point, where I often tell my channel, I know literally nothing about your life. I'm a person in a screen. And the day you're born, you're offered nothing in life except your own death. You don't know how much money you'll make. You don't know if you'll get married. You don't know if you'll go to Bhutan. But the way to deal with decadence, in my opinion, is to hold some sense of dignity and personal honor. And without that, we're kind of lost in the world. And I tell my audience, I can offer you nothing in life except honor. And that's the way you stop decadence, by holding some kind of value beyond whatever material gain you're going to have in that second.
That's a great note to end on. I appreciate everything you've done today. Thank you for being here. We're looking forward to have you back in the future. It was a fascinating talk. If you want to find out more about what he does, it's What If Alt Hist. Go to YouTube. You'll see hundreds of hours of interesting conversations about this sort of stuff. Please like and subscribe to his YouTube channel, ours as well. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and we're really honored to have Jan Jekielek of Epoch Times joining Brigadier General Robert Spalding for a fascinating conversation that sort of takes the next step. We've talked about the rise and fall and rise of American society and civilization. We're also now going to talk about the near-peer threats and what we do about those, the challenges that we face in real time today. So we'll be back in just a few minutes. Look forward to visiting with you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Check out our podcast.